one's on Passion. This is Passion number 4. I will blend in the death of Moses and going on to talking about Joshua. Joshua is important. When the Philistines were destroyed, it was hard on everyone, and Egypt had a battle with the Hittites. But within a couple of years after that battle with the Hittites, which was a draw, the Egyptians did not win, and the Hittites did not win, and the Philistines were already wiped off the face of the earth, and they had not been put in the land that was being fought over, because this now was declared as land belonging to Egypt up to the river, and Egypt agreed with the Hittites not to go north of that river. The Hittites agreed to not go south of that river. So south of the river belonged to the Egyptians, and that is where the Egyptians put the Philistines. The Philistines were their trading partners for 4,000 years, but by this time, Egypt knows the Philistines are gone. All of their ships have been wiped out, and it is now true that the Phoenicians have stepped up and started using their ships to do the trading that was being done by the Philistines prior to that. When the Philistines were put in the 5 cities that were up next to the river, where Egypt now had the treaty with the Hittites, that was the Canaanites that were in that land. But we know from the destruction of Jericho, by the time the Philistines were destroyed and Israel went out in the wilderness for 40 years and then went to the trading areas when the Canaanites were ruling in the land of Jericho. And that was when the land of Jericho was still in the trading empire that was run by the Philistines. The Philistines were in that area as well. That's why when you read the Bible, Abraham dealt with the Philistines and bought land from the Philistines or traded with the Philistines as well, because Moses knew the Philistines were in that area. When the Philistines were trading, the Philistines had traders going every place. Even though there were not a lot of them, there were some. They went because they were watching to make sure the trading was going on like it was supposed to. And everyone knew you had to get along with the Philistines. If you weren't going to get along with the Philistines, you weren't part of the trading empire. Unfortunately, when the Philistines were destroyed, and since the societies could no longer support themselves, they had to migrate to areas that could support them. And that's why the boat people were here. All they were migrant workers wanting to find a place where they could live and support themselves and be part of another nation. They had to leave the place they were at, and they were looking for a new homeland. But as the Canaanites no longer participated in the cities that were part of the trading empire, Jericho collapsed as well. And when an earthquake took out the wall of Jericho, and it was just a desolated town with the wall fallen down, made another good story about the Hebrews. He did tell a story, he embellished a bit, and he used a woman that supposedly was in that ended up being part of the what we'd call the bloodline of David, and therefore she became an Israeli citizen, and maybe she was a Canaanite woman, because we know the Canaanites were still wandering around some of the land when the Hebrews were moving in as well, but most of them were leaving the area, going to a more fertile land. And we know that deeper into Africa, that the people there were prospering. So the people that were in the area that was the wilderness area that was being wandered in by the Israeli people was all part of Saudi Arabia. And that, when you get to the very south end of the continent, you cross a small body of water and you are in the part of Africa that was booming. So people were moving to that area. We know that because the area that was occupied during this time period was a group of people that built buildings in an area that was only for show. It was a group of people that basically were tradesmen, and they were trading from things in Africa, and a lot of gold came out. So all of these things were built up as the land was starting to grow. So as Africa was starting to increase in agriculture and in mining and other areas, the Canaanites were moving to that area. We have indications that when King Solomon became sexually connected with the woman from Africa as well, and they had a child, that when that child went back to Israel, he made a connection with some of the people there, and some of the Hebrew people went back with him to his homeland as well. When he found out that they were facing problems from what now had become known as the Babylonians and the Assyrians. They were the nations that had grown up, and Cyrus hadn't taken over yet. So the people were suffering all over the land Canaanites had been in, and then the Hebrews came to, and then the Hebrews moved out of and came back to. This was all during a time of growth in Africa. And so all of these people moved to Africa because Africa was a place where people prospered. But Africa moved with camels. But that's what caused most of the camels to come over into the area that we refer to as Saudi Arabia. They have camels as well, but those camels were generally all from Africa. And they did very well there, and they helped the land to prosper to some degree. But we know the big land that was here in all of this area was oil. So until oil became more prestigious, the land wasn't good for much of anything. It was mainly just occupied by what was known as Arabs, and the Arabs were mainly traders from Africa. That was the Canaanites that were in that land. But we know from the destruction of Jericho, by the time the Philistines were destroyed and Israel went out in the wilderness for 40 years and then went to the trading area, Moses was called by God to do a job. And the job that Moses was called by God to do was to take a bunch of herdsmen and make a nation out of them. And as I said before, Moses did a spectacular job, but it took time. So Moses explained the time by having a story about them trying to get into the promised land and not really being able to do that, because in reality, from the writing, we are aware that some of the Israelites did try to move into the land and were resisted and were beaten back. So the writing that we have is a mixture of actual events that happened and a story for the people to believe in the future that the land was theirs and promised to them by God. So I will separate some of those incidents, and they come about as a result of our archaeology that we've discovered since then. So what the main thing is that when Joshua took over, a lot of the things that Joshua did in the writing was an exact duplicate of what Moses did when he left Egypt. And as I have expressed before, primarily the Levites were the only ones that were in Egypt, or basically all of the people that came out of Egypt basically aligned themselves with the Levite tribe, which were the priests and basically the governors of the nation. As the nation was being built and the laws were being established, it would be the Levites that would be the one making the judgments about who would do it, obeyed the laws, and who transgressed on the laws. And in making these judgments, sometimes other laws would be added to the 10 Commandments that Moses was given on Mount Sinai. Now, as part of this time needed to be taken, it was taken by the story that they weren't able to get into the promised land because they did not have enough faith. So they had to wander 40 years in the wilderness. Now, part of this story is to make things work and the timeline to work. Because, as I said, at the time that Moses had to leave Egypt, he did not have anything to do with the Ramses. The Ramses would not be Pharaoh's peers, and it was only when the Ramses became pharaohs of Egypt was it known that Egypt had slaves. Up to this time, Egypt did not have any slaves. As I have said before 1550 BCE, Egypt used most of the work that was done with the help of the Philistines and the elephants that were trained to move heavy loads. That's how the pyramids got built and the large stones got moved into place, because the elephants did the work, not the slaves. As I said before, when I was in school, I was taught that slaves did everything. Our archaeology today has proven that Egypt did not have slaves back then. So slavery was not on the table to be discussed. Now, I understand now why that was, is because the Philistines ruled for 4,000 to 8,000 years, and they had no slaves in the world at all. It was some individual minor communities where the horsepower engine of the men tried to subjugate people to things that were unnatural. And by unnatural, it means take a human being and make a slave of him. That is going to be a resistance from those human beings for the rest of their life. God did not create us to be slaves, and so therefore we don't want to be. We want to be free. We want to make our own decisions. God gave us the ability to have choices, and we want the freedom to make those choices. And that is why the passion portion is the part I'm talking about here, because freedom is a passion that human beings have, and they will always strive to have it if they come to the conclusion that they are lacking in area. And I am expressing it here because I feel I'm lacking it in America. We do not have freedom in America because our women are not free. They are still subjugated as second-class citizens. A lot of that is religious. And so therefore, I'm not going to talk about it in the religious part of my discussion, because in the passion part of the discussion, and I expressed about people's opinion, you can have any opinion and you can think anything you want to think. We've got to make sure the government knows that we're free, and the government has to say women are absolutely free. If the government says that, then the citizens will follow and do what the government tells them to do. They will obey the laws of the land, and even though some of the horsepower engines of men will always fight against that, trying to subjugate women as property or something that the horsepower engine can utilize, because the horsepower engine does not make a distinction about the difference between animals, about objects, and about human beings. As far as the horsepower engine is concerned, he's willing to subjugate all of them. And therefore, the laws of the land have to prevent that from men being able to use a horsepower engine to do things that God did not create us to do. He created us to be equal and to share the equality with the women. And the reason we know that is our history proves it. When the Philistines allowed their women to be equal, they did not have any fighting going on for 4,000 to 8,000 years. And since the Philistines were destroyed by the Thera volcano in 1550 BCE, we've had the murder and mayhem years, and many of hundreds of thousands and millions of people have died, and a lot of those have died as a result of other human beings killing them. Now, we must remember that if someone is offensively killing someone, going in to take over something that doesn't belong to them, and kills another human being, we've got to have government rules that say anyone that wants to act like an animal will be treated like an animal and will be caged. And so what we want to know is that as part of the thinking that we have to all adapt, we have to know that the attitude about having kings in the world and the kings getting together and saying, we'll make an agreement that our government can't now zero in on the leaders of the nation. Now, that was done in order to protect the leaders of the nation. If the leader of a nation offensively creates a situation where other human beings get killed, he's no less of an animal than any other animal that kills a human being, and he needs to be caged. The people need to start thinking that way. People need to adopt that in their opinion. They need to teach their children and the other people in the nation that they're in. It is wrong for one human being to kill another human being for any and every reason. And if someone starts doing it, we need to put them in a cage and isolate them so they cannot engage in that horsepower engine running amok and doing the things that God did not create him to do. Now, as we move on and talk about Joshua, we know from history that the area that the Philistines they have been placed there by the Egyptians just recently, within a few years, 40 to 50 years after the Philistines were put on the cities that Egypt placed them on land that belonged to Egypt, in the hill country of area that did not belong to Egypt, was where the Canaanites lived. But the Canaanites been falling apart for 300 years since the destruction of the Philistines' trading empire. When that trading empire ended, the whole world had to undergo a change. And part of it was due to the ash in the atmosphere because of the eruption of the volcano that incinerated the Philistines. And we know that Plato and Socrates had very clear understanding of the Philistines because when Moses talked about them, he put the Philistines right where they were. Now, it is true that all of the people referred to them were on the coastland. They had already started planting and raising olives so they could get back into olive oil production. But as Joshua moved into the area, there may have been some straggling people left around, but the trading empire had imploded, and there were no cities that were able to function because the cities needed the traffic going through the city with the people taking the trade items all the way from India up to the coastland so that the Philistines could load it on their boats and continue the trading throughout the Mediterranean, all the way to the British Isles that was effective at that time, all the way up to the Scandinavian countries. And the items that came up from India came through the Levant, which is the Fertile Crescent, the area between the Tigris and Euphrates River. And then when we end, now I want to thank all of you for coming. I'm going to end session number 4. I want to thank you for subscribing and following my channel. Thank you very much, and I hope that you come back and enjoy what you're hearing.